everyone, how you going? Really excited to be here, and it's been awesome. Now, it's a bit hard to see. It's quite bright up here, but I believe there's one Australian also in the room. Can I get a show of hands? Okay, it's just me. No, all good. No, thank you. Hey, so yeah, here to present about lessons learned building OT SOCs. So who am I? I am on X as B Large. Yeah, I'm Chief Evangelist and Principal OT Security Architect at Sokolv. Worked in IT and OT for 15 years. I'm also a chartered engineer, so a CPeng and a registered professional engineer of Queensland. And again, anyone in the room, are you members of SIGRAE or have heard of SIGRAE? Yes, okay. So I'm actually the convener for Workgroup 251 about building OT SOCs in the electric sector. Yeah, I studied telecoms and a Master of Business and Applied Finance, and I have a few certificates. Also, maybe show of hands, anyone who's done SABSA or security architecture? Excellent, very good. And a 62443 certified expert. I have GICSP, Grid, GSOM, and did the 612 course. Really lots of fun. So if you're doing that next week, yeah, it's really great. So why this presentation? So I've actually been in different roles in SOCs. I worked in a SOC as a network support engineer, and I've also been in SOC leadership, and I've also worked with third-party SOCs. So I kind of have some interesting views I want to share. So, bit of a mind map of what we're going to talk about today. So starting with people, thinking about like leadership, training, moving into process, which is really important, how you scale. Technology, so like where to start. There's a lot of things you can do. And I kind of want to close out with some resources to help out. So people, so leading the team, super important, right? So as the leader, you really need to balance being the tech lead and being the team lead. And your job is there to support and guide the team. This is quite tricky if you've been a technical leader in the past. You know, how do you develop? How do you mentor? And importantly, you got to ask, how do you flex your management style to each team member? And this was something I found as a SOC leader. You really have to protect the team from the workload. Personally, I like Kanban boards, making work visual. Having pull systems rather than push systems is really important. And this one's really important. You need to manage up and manage out through the organization. I think we had Blake earlier today. You got to get out there. You got to work with people. You got to champion your team, right? If you're not doing that, it's really difficult for your team to have top cover to deliver. And probably something that I was doing as I was leaving my previous organization was actually developing a SOC charter. So getting on paper what you're doing, what's important, and getting expectations clear, right? So yeah, I would really recommend people, if you haven't, invest the time, build a SOC charter. So training and development. So my priority as a SOC leader was to develop my analyst capabilities, right? Now training it's a scarce resource. You know, it's OpEx, it's a budget that you have to fight for. And it's tough because sometimes you have to balance what people in your team want to do versus what the team needs, right? You know, we all want to go on SANS courses. We're all here, hopefully, on a SANS course. But you know, that's a significant investment, right? And you need to balance that through the team. And even the topics, right? You might have people that want to study incident response, or they might need to study architecture, or they might need to study, you know, security operations. So how do you balance that through the team? What I find useful is using one-on-ones. So having that kind of monthly half-hour session with your team so you can really understand the individual, understand their preferences, and figure out how to build a good training plan. There's some really good, you know, stuff online about this, but my training preference, I like to learn frameworks and then apply them. Other people like just to get hands-on, right, and do stuff. So just throwing it out there, you know, have those conversations one-on-one in a, you know, safe space, and you can ask like what people want to do, how they like learning. And then importantly, if you do send people on training, ask them to do teachbacks, right? So good model. I've done this personally after 612. 1 hour session, you just go back to your team, what you liked about the training, resources, things you found useful. And it's a really great way to actually diffuse capability, but it also gives people that opportunity to practice speaking, you know, talking to people. And it's a great way for the SOC to get out there with other parts of the business. And I'm a big fan of, if, you know, before we put people on training, that they spend some time, do some internet research, great resources from SANS posters, those kind of things. So people actually kind of are prepared to make the most of the opportunity. And I really liked this concept. I think it might be from Chris Sanders, but basically we train individually as security practitioners, but often in a response, we need to work as a team. And the behaviors you develop when you train individually are different to how you work as a team, right? So if you get opportunities to do group in-house training or, can pull together a team that works together, it's a great opportunity. I've been fortunate to do this with the Australian Cybersecurity Centre. Some of their people run training, industry sector training. So as the electricity sector participants, we got to do training as a team with people we would be working with in an incident. Awesome, right? Teaches really good content, builds trust and rapport, and means as a team, you can learn how people work, people's styles. So, if you're in an incident, you're not doing it for the first time. So a few of these resources I'm sharing are actually from the now LDR 551, when I did it, MGT 551, which is Building and Leading Security Operations Center. So I came across this concept in the training about the SOC human capital model. And what's exciting about this is a research project where researchers actually just worked in a SOC and, observed what happened, built experiments, and it's cool because it's evidence-based, right? And they built this model where you have these kind of 3 different cycles that integrate with each other, right? And the idea is in this core cycle of, by developing, skills, we can empower, which will build creativity, which then develops growth. And you get a virtuous repeating cycle, right? And as you're building this capability in your team, your metrics will improve, and you're also getting operational efficiencies. You're also getting internal reflection, learning what you're doing. And all of this stuff together means management can see, hey, return on investment. And I think Jason was mentioning in one of the workshops, like, if we can frame things in business terms and use terms like ROI, really helps our business stakeholders understand, hey, this is why we're here and this is what we're doing. And again, all of this means we're doing a good job. We can demonstrate we're doing a good job. That encourages investment. So if you haven't, would really recommend this conference paper here from Usenix. I'm actually going to put my slides up on GitHub later tonight. Depends how much I drink with Rob. So, it's happened before. Anyway, but yeah, so keep an eye out. But yeah, definitely some really great resources. So communication, we're doing it now. It's vital to invest in your communication skills for your team, right? And importantly, it's both written and verbal. Security operations centers, they're stressful places, shift handovers, how you're developing, records and knowledge for your team. And importantly, we all communicate differently, right? Like, I personally prefer speaking. Other people prefer writing. Some people might like blogs. Some people might like, tickets. I don't know. But as a team, understanding how people communicate and also how you can flex your style to work better with the team is really, really good. And maybe a show of hands, has anyone done Chris Sanders' effective information security writing? Nice. Yeah. It's a great course. It's also really good value for money. So would recommend, it kind of talks through both security incident, SOC ticket kind of style writing and penetration test style writing. Everyone who's a manager of people, you should put your people on this training. Super good value for money. So process. So mental models are incredibly important, right? They allow us to orientate in our environment. And importantly, it's a great way to quickly onboard new analysts, right? And I think you can use mental models to help encourage rotations in your team, right? So how can you rotate your IT SOC, your OT SOC, security engineering, security architecture, so you have a shared understanding of the environment and how you better work together. Who here actually has a SOC ride-along day? No? Has anyone heard the term before? Yeah, so, yep, thanks. Yeah, so I think it was a company in Australia that I first heard the concept, a telco. But what they did is they basically once a month opened up the SOC so other people could come in, see how the SOC worked, project teams, architecture teams, anyone that's a kind of a technology function. So they could actually see how the SOC works and how they can integrate together, right? I think it's a great idea. It's a really good way that you can, build understanding, build trust, and just get people to know like what you're doing. And again, Chris Sanders, some really great papers here. There's a particular podcast interview on Blueprint where he talks about convergent and divergent thinking and metacognition, so how people think about thinking. Really, really great. And I think something very important, especially for new analysts, to help them understand, like how do the experienced people orientate and solve problems, right? Because when you're new, it can be a bit overwhelming just to see people who've been doing it for like 5 to 10 years just have really good intuition or kind of not be able to explain how they do it. So knowledge bases. Importantly, everyone's ICS, it is different, right? And it has its own little quirks, but your team will have a wealth of critical knowledge, both in the SOC and outside the SOC. So through a knowledge base, we can actually capture knowledge for our new team members, right? So when we're onboarding people, when we're doing projects, my team I used to run, we would rotate on call, off call. The knowledge base was super useful to understand, hey, what's been happening? Just a great place to dump useful, SIEM queries, and just a great place for like, hey, here's all the login pages, whatever. And this is something I actually heard a good friend of mine in Australia present on, but how can you actually bootstrap building a KB? Because it can be quite overwhelming, right? It can be a lot of work. So the model he used was you basically find a subject matter expert in your team, you time box them to say, look, you have an hour to prepare to do a session with the team. So, it's pretty rough. You then have a lunch and learn, could be a half hour, could be an hour. And you also nominate someone else in the team to take the notes from that session. And then the person who presents actually checks the notes. And it's a really great way, over time, you can organically build up a KB. So really, really great suggestion there. And something that I've found quite useful in companies is a controlled document framework. So this is how you have, authorized, approved, standards, procedures, those kind of things. But they can be quite cumbersome. They can take time to update, review, et cetera, So sometimes, knowledge that's a bit more, rough or, in working, if you will, could live in the KB. But a KB can't replace controlled documents, right? The two have to work together. So also, very important, where is the KB? So if you are, say you're at an industrial site and one of your approaches is to disconnect, you might have the SIEM built inside your OT environment, ideally. But if you pull the links and you can't get to the KB, it's going to make incident response really hard, right? Also, it's an incredibly important crown jewel that an adversary will target. So have you secured it? Do you have MFA? Yes, so very, very useful, but also very, very attractive for a target. So detection engineering. So this is the thing I took away, like that I most enjoyed in my training. What I really like about detection engineering is it gives structure to how you manage use cases, right? And it also gives you a really great way to make your detection be enriched through other activities, be that, cyber risk assessments, cyber threat intelligence, project work. I actually realized when I was kind of reviewing my slides, I forgot to talk about threat hunting. Oops. So, using threat hunting to inform detection engineering, super, super useful. And this is something I learned. So not only when you create use cases and actually having good detection, but making it such that an analyst can make it actionable. So as we were making use cases, they were like overwhelming analysts, right? We'd like, okay, this looks interesting. And then we get 1,000 tickets. Okay, analysts start getting upset. My job as the team lead to say, oh, we've got this out of balance, right? So detection engineering can give you some really good structure, right? It can help out with, say, next steps and playbooks. If you've written a detection and you don't really know what you're going to do if it fires, that's not a good time for the team, right? And importantly, giving that metadata and being able to flag the metadata. In 551, they kind of talk about 3 types of rules. High confidence. So if someone's dropping LSAS in your DMZ, it's a bad time. You got to get on top of that, right? Investigative is, hey, this looks kind of weird, but you know, like it could be malicious, it could be benign. If I see a few of these things together, I need to go investigate, right? And anomaly is really, you know, to Will talking about earlier with Rob, anomaly is not just show me all the crazy different stuff in your network. It should be around, hey, this just isn't right, or this is out of character, right? But your like cognitive load and your mental model for high confidence is incredibly different to anomaly. And the amount that you can, you know, process is very different depending on the type of rule. And you also need to kind of consider like, what's the life cycle of the rule, right? Is it experimental? You know, is it very early? You're trying to figure it out. You're trying to, you know, put some data through it to see what happens. Because the way you know, you could say to your analysts, it's experimental, it's low priority, get to it when you get to it. If it's functional or stable, yeah, you got to get to it. And the way our team was structured, we would do a week on call, a week on detection engineering, and a week on projects, right? So it allowed analysts to try to build rules, to try stuff, see how it works, but at the same time, not overwhelm the other analysts. And I think something I found very, very useful is we actually created a request for detection process, or an RFD. So this was using like a GitLab instance where when you're triaging the queue and you think, hey, this rule isn't tuned, or you know what, this is cool, I think it'd be great if we built something that could do this. It means you don't have to context switch between queue triage and building rules, right? And it gives you a backlog of stuff to feed your detection engineers, right? There's a really great SANS blog from the Purple teaming group on just how to do detection engineering. Would really recommend checking that out. And I think, yeah, detection engineering is a great way to bring structure into like how you're actually getting value out of your scene. In this case, you know, kind of came into the role, awesome, we have a seam. Oh, great, nothing's configured. So I'm sure I'm not the only one. But use case management and seams is super important and a lot of effort. So metrics and reporting, and we've touched on metrics in a few talks, which has been really, really great. Importantly, you want a mix of leading and lagging, right? They all can't be lagging because you don't know if you're kind of putting effort in the right place. And they all can't be leading because you need to be able to show that you're actually doing good stuff. And less is more, right? So I think you want to try and keep to maybe 6. You want to be able to easily put it on one PowerPoint deck. You might have sub metrics, but at that top level, keeping it to 6 and trying to keep it to like the broader SOC functions of, you know, say collection, detection, how you do response is a really great way to make it easy for people to at a high level understand, you know, how's the function going. And I mean, I'm sure people in the room have heard about OKRs, objectives and key results. I really like OKRs. They really help with goal cascade. So you can kind of have a big picture thing of like, we want to build an OT SOC, and you can start breaking it down into measurable things. And you can then start allocating those key results to other people in the team who then might cascade into other OKRs. So if you haven't seen OKRs, really, really great concept and really, really good for how you actually improve the capability of your SOC, right? So yeah, Blueprint. Anyone in the room listen to the SANS Blueprint podcast? Yep, awesome. Super great. So in season 4, they actually go chapter by chapter of the MITRE 11 strategies of a world-class SOC with the authors. And it's fascinating. It's just a great way to actually, you know, kind of hear from the people who write the book. And it just gives a whole other dimension to the chapters, right? And there's also a specific episode, I think it's in season 1 for episode 11 of SOC Metrics, where John goes through some really great material on just how to build metrics. And ideally how you're trying to use metrics to prevent burnout. So purple teaming. So, you know, I've been touching on this people, process, and technology concepts, right? A SOC is way more than just a bunch of security controls, right? It's how we move stuff together. I was very excited to see the V model and systems engineering before. This isn't a stitch up, but yeah, because I love systems engineering, right? So I made this kind of, you know, I was thinking, hey, like, how would you apply systems engineering to cybersecurity? So I call it the cyber V model. So we go concept, design, development. And using some 62443 terms, out of our concept, we should be building our cybersecurity requirement specification, which is what we do at the end of our kind of initial risk assessment activities. We then do design, and that design process, we'll be using a design specification, and then we get into build, develop. And at this point, the left-hand side is design activities, the right-hand side is building stuff, right? So we're doing our component verification. This is where we use things like, I saw unit testing in yours, very good. But, things where we're using, say, static code analysis, other kind of AppSec tools, right? And then we use a vulnerability assessment to validate a design, right? Now, vulnerability assessment might be a desktop assessment, might be a pen test, might even be kind of like a benchmarking assessment, depending on what you're trying to do. But ideally, we're going to use that design as a basis to do validation. And then at the highest level, we should be using red teaming to validate the concept, right? Because red teaming is not just, it's not just doing the controls. It's looking at, well, can the analysts respond? Earlier today when we're talking about the exercises, right? Like, how are we learning things? Like, how can we do things better? So yeah, this is something I've kind of presented at the APAC summit, I think in 22, but the Cyber V model. And I think it's just a good way to kind of, sometimes stakeholders will get confused between a red team and a pen test, and is just a red team a better pen test? Well, no, they're actually doing different things, right? So technology. So personally, I think if you're really stuck trying to build an OT SOC, starting at the OT DMZ is the best place. And in my experience with a outsourced security operations provider, it was actually really good to kind of extend the IT security capability into the OT DMZ as a starting point. So I'm sure people have heard the term, OT DMZ or IDMZ. What's good about it? It's that nice place where we can integrate IT and OT, and it's full of a lot of similar and well-known IT systems, right? And that means it's probably an easy place to start collecting logs. Now, I can't remember the statistic if it's 90 or 95% or where I saw it, but the overwhelming majority of OT security incidents, they start at the IT-OT edge, right? So to me, it's a very defensible place to start building visibility and collection. And it's a really, I think, an easy way to sell to management. Hey, this is how we move into this space, right? And it's also a great way that you build trust with your OT stakeholders. I think we were hearing earlier from Exxon, how do you actually build that trust with someone that you're not going to bin their OT system or their DCS or their SCADA systems? By working in the DMZs, you can actually show, hey, we get your context, we know how to work with you. You can establish rules of racing, management change, all that really good stuff. Now, unfortunately, I got this wrong. So this is actually control number 3. But I'm always talking about architecture, so I just went on autopilot and said number 2. But no, so I'm sure everyone in the room, we've heard talking about the SANS 5 critical ICS controls. If you haven't, definitely read it. Super, super good resource. And I think it's creating a really good language for how we talk to each other. I'd also recommend the SANS webinar with Tim and Rob, because there's like heaps of really good information, context. There's a bit of derailment from memory. But I know there's I can't remember what you're saying, Rob, but I'm actually quite proud of it because you referenced the ASD Essential 8, which is just a great framework, an Australian framework. But what's cool about the E8 is basically they did root cause on cybersecurity incidents with the people that Australian Signals Directorate work with, right? Which is like Australian government departments, big critical infrastructure. And basically through root cause, they said, hey, 85% of the incidents would have been prevented if you just did these 5 controls. So 8 controls. So like, Rob and Tim were saying, they're actually looking at incidents to go, hey, this is what would have made this not happen, which is really important because other frameworks are theoretical. Hey, we're thinking top down. What I like about these models is it's ground truth reality, right? So industrial NIDS, control number 2. I think if you're stuck in what to do, the NIDS approach, sorry, control number 3. I think if you're stuck in what to do, NIDS is a really good capability that you can put, in parallel with your existing ICS and, not be as disruptive as trying to, do other collection methods. But I think what's super important is you have to understand your network flows and your network choke points, right? So there's no point just putting a single, network industrial intrusion detection system on the edge if you're worried about kind of use cases that are actually east-west, right? So you have to sit down and think, hey, these are the critical assets, these are the network flows, and try to find those common points where you can pull traffic together. And importantly, in control number 1, you should be defining those use cases, right? And through those use cases, you should understand the actor techniques, tactics, and procedures. And those TTPs should really help you determine where do you need visibility, right? Again, this is from the white paper, kind of shows a good progression of where you're doing effort and where you're getting payback, right? So to me, industrial NIDS, it's a really nice sweet spot of if you don't really know where to go or where to start, do the DMZ, then do an industrial NIDS program. And budgets, people are budget constrained. I think figure out your choke points. There's some really, really good open source NSM tools, network security monitoring tools. We heard about Security Onion, for example. You can use these for pilots to prove value, right? The other good thing is if you have an incident, you've actually pre-deployed that network capture capability. And hopefully you have something that if there's an incident, it's not the Schrodinger's ICS scenario that unfortunately a lot of asset operators have. Who here has a collection management framework? Excellent. Yeah, well, I know you do, Rob. So CMFs are really good because the alternative is log everything. So a collection management framework, it's a defensible method to figure out your requirements for logging, your retention, and a really good tool to figure out, do you have coverage, right? And if we think about detection engineering, there's no point doing detection engineering if you haven't got the logs to begin with, right? There's a Dragos white paper would really recommend. Kind of walks through theory, background, but importantly, it has this kind of, hey, like what does good look like? So you can think about different asset types, where it is in the network, and things like, hey, like what are you collecting? How long do you retain? Is it only on the device? Can you do centralized logging? So definitely something to think about if you haven't done one. A collection management framework is really, really useful for understanding what you have and where your gaps are. And yeah, it's an important tool you'll use in other security processes. There's another SANS Dragos white paper, 6 steps for effective threat hunting. Using a CMF to make sure you can actually have the logs for your hypothesis is incredibly important, right? And also, yeah, for your detection engineering, you can use it for budgets, right? Are you collecting the right things? And if we come back to the Cyber V model, this is where we think about pen testing, right? So we're building new security controls. How do we validate they actually work? How do we go from, we did the project and we hope it works, to, hey, we can actually have confidence it is working. And by doing it, you can actually create really rich detection engineering data, right? Personally, I felt a lot more relieved the first time we ran a pen test on the IT/OT interfaces, and I could see which use cases were firing, which weren't firing. But it went from, hey, we did all this stuff and I really hope it works, to, hey, we can actually validate that use case we were able to pick up. And the findings from the pen test would then enrich our detection engineering for, hey, like, how would we find this? I also think it really helps build analyst confidence. So if you haven't done this and you've never tested your rules, you're just really hoping that, if it kicks off, it's going to work. Versus, hey, we did a pen test, we validated stuff, we've been able to see it in action, that whole like train hard, fight easy kind of stuff. I think it really helps. So again, just another, refresher. So at this point, we're doing kind of pen testing to validate a design, right? Validate technology. So I've kind of touched on a few references, just want to kind of go through them again in one spot. So yeah, MITRE 11 strategies for a world-class SOC, super useful document, right? It's also just a good reference document. Like you don't really sit down and read, page to page or cover to cover, sorry. But I found it very, very useful. And for example, in strategy number 2, the SOC authority to do its job, that's where SOC charters come up. and some really good examples. Has good examples of how different SOCs are structured, tips on like hiring people, how you retain people, how you use cyber threat intelligence. Really, really great document. Really, really well written. I really like this UK NCSC reference of building a security operations center. It's really well written and really well structured. One of the real takeaways I took is this must-have logs concept. So this for me was kind of that mill one. This is the starting point. Yeah, even before a collection management framework, like how do I collect all the authentication logs I need to collect? If I have security controls, am I picking up that logging? And importantly, can I get DNS? So do I understand, if OT equipment is just talking to completely inappropriate external systems, right? So those kind of three classes of must-have logs, I think, are a really, really good starting point. And I quite like this diagram. It kind of helps people. It's probably hard for people in the back to see, sorry, but it kind of helps figure out like where you should use, say, threat hunting versus detection engineering versus, anomaly detection with AI, ML, those kind of things. But it's kind of an axis of your attacker sophistication and the volume of data you have. So yeah, really good resource, would really recommend it. Has anyone here done a SOC CMM assessment? Yeah, nice. So good, yeah. So I believe Rob did this as his uni master thesis and went, hey, the world can have this. So thank you, Rob, that's really good. But kind of breaks down at a high level the kind of different functions of the SOC and allows you to kind of, rate your capability. Has some really nice like reporting, this kind of like spider chart in the back end. But yeah, big shout out to Huff, who I used to be Huff's team leader. When Huff started in the team, we're like, oh, we should do the SOC CMM. So really great way to help us, show our current capability, where we're getting to. And if we think back to that human capital model, a great way to show the business what we're doing. Do we have any EPRI members in the room? Yep. So if you're an EPRI and you're in the cyber programs, I would highly recommend, if you haven't checked out the integrated SOC or the ISOC, you should. It's just a really good kind of white paper, if you will. And because, it's EPRI and electrical engineers understand EPRI, it's a good way to kind of build trust with your stakeholders. But the key kind of concept is you're pulling in your IT kind of security telemetry, if you will. You're pulling in your physical security, you're pulling in your control center head end kind of telemetry and your field telemetry and pulling into a Fusion SOC, right? And I think it's just a really good model to kind of show how security can work with and enable other functions. So yeah, shout out, I've said a few times, LDR 551, the GSOM certificate, structured, 5-day course. So kind of day one's around SOC design, planning, how you're building, job descriptions and things for your team. Day two is really about telemetry, SIEMs, data collection. Day three was my favorite, talks about, detection engineering, hunting, triage, how that kind of like real core functionality of the SOC. Day four, incident response. And day five, I found very useful as a new leader because it was helping me with things like how do we not burn out analysts? How do we understand different ways of working in the team? And how do we use continuous improvement, right? So a big shout out to Glenn, my former boss. I was like, hey, Glenn, I want to do this course, and he approved it, so thank you. And then, massive shout out for the Blueprint podcast. So John and the team do some really, really great talks. Dean Parsons has actually been one of the guests on the Blueprint podcast, talking about OT security. But a super great resource, and something I definitely would encourage anyone who's doing, kind of SOC work, you should check it out. So I'm kind of aware I've given you a whole bunch of stuff. So in summary, so if we think about people, be an enabling leader, right? Super important that you build your team. And you guide the team. So don't dictate, but just, bring them on the journey. The SOC human capital model is a great, paper, would really recommend reading it. And as a, people leader, how do you develop your team's communication skills? We think about processes, develop mental models, share mental models, use detection engineering, enable knowledge management, empower your team with metrics, and validate your capabilities with purple teaming. And if we close out on tech, if you don't know where to start, the OT DMZ, really, really good. Deploy industrial NIDs, very useful. Developing a CMF, you'll definitely not regret that. And validate your technology with pen testing. And with that, that's me. So thank you. And yeah, thank you.